Millionaire catches black cleaner breastfeeding her daughter. He takes an unexpected action. You have two options: dismissal for cause or voluntary resignation by tomorrow. Margaret Thompson's sharp voice echoed through the meeting room as Kesha Williams stood, clutching her document folder tightly. The choice is yours. Kesha was only 24 years old and never imagined that her dedicated 2 years as a cleaning lady at Goldstein Industries would end with a false accusation of theft. Her eyes met those of Margaret, the human resources supervisor, who had always treated her with barely concealed contempt, and something cold ran down her spine. Based on what exactly? Kesha asked, her voice too calm for someone who had just been accused of a crime. Margaret smiled with venomous satisfaction. Security cameras caught you in the CEO's office last night. Unauthorized access after hours. She slid a printed photo across the desk. Care to explain? In the grainy image, Kesha appeared seated in Alexander Goldstein's leather chair, but Margaret had conveniently omitted a crucial detail. Her 4-month-old daughter, Amara, was in her arms breastfeeding during a medical emergency. Interesting camera angle, Kesha muttered, examining the photo with a calmness that made Margaret frown. Very selective. Don't try to play smart with me, girl. You broke into a restricted area and you got caught. Game over. Margaret leaned back in her chair, savoring every word. People like you always think they can take advantage of other people's kindness. Kesha carefully folded the photo and tucked it into her folder. People like me. You know exactly what I mean. Single mothers with no education who use their children to get favors. Margaret didn't bother to hide her venom. You thought you could seduce the boss with that working mother story? Pathetic. For a moment that seemed like an eternity, Kesha remained silent. Then something almost imperceptible changed in her posture. Are you done? I was just getting started. Security will be called in 10 minutes to escort you out. Your personal belongings will be mailed to you. Margaret typed something into the computer with exaggerated satisfaction. Oh, and don't think about using our company as a reference. No one hires thieves. Kesha stood up slowly, her dignity unshaken despite the storm raging inside her. Margaret, can I ask you a question? Get it over with. Did you check the hallway? Cameras that show exactly why I was there. The smile playing on Kesha's lips was almost imperceptible. Or did you just see what you wanted to see? Margaret hesitated for a split second before regaining her arrogance. I don't care about your excuses. The fact is, you were where you shouldn't have been. You're right. Kesha walked toward the door, her steps measured and deliberate. I definitely was where I shouldn't have been. At the threshold, she turned one last time. Margaret, what is it now? Some people make the mistake of underestimating others based on appearances. Kesha smiled with a serenity that sent a chill down Margaret's spine, but they find out too late that not all wolves wear wolfskins. When the door closed, Margaret tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in her stomach. There was something in Kesha's eyes, a calmness that only exists in those who have weathered much worse storms and lived to tell the story. What Margaret had no idea was that at that very moment, Kesha was walking through the halls with the serenity of someone who holds a secret too powerful to be revealed before the time is right. If this story of prejudice and injustice touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple moment of humiliation would become the catalyst for a revolution that no one would ever forget. 3 days after her dismissal, Kesha was standing in line at the bank at 6 o'clock in the morning, holding Amara in her arms and a stack of overdue bills in her free hand. The manager, Mr. Patterson, barely concealed his discomfort as he reviewed her account. I'm sorry, Ms. Williams, but without proof of income, I can't extend your apartment loan. He avoided looking directly at the whimpering baby. You have 15 days to get back on track or we'll begin foreclosure proceedings. Kesha nodded calmly, as if hearing about imminent eviction was part of her morning routine. I understand completely. What Mr. Patterson didn't know was that Kesha had spent the entire night not crying about her situation, but methodically typing on her used laptop while Amara slept. She carefully organized every screenshot, every email, every recorded conversation she had collected over the past 2 years working at Goldstein Industries. Margaret Thompson, on the other hand, was having the week of her life. She had spread the word throughout the company that she had cleaned house by firing a problematic employee who was trying to take advantage of the CEO. Friday happy hour at the bar across the street from the office, her version of the story became even more dramatic. You should have seen the look on her face when I showed her the photos. Margaret gestured dramatically to her colleagues in the finance department. She tried to convince me she was breastfeeding, as if a baby is an excuse for trespassing. Lisa, from accounting, frowned. But if she really was breastfeeding, please. Margaret laughed too loudly. These people always make up dramatic excuses. Single mothers, you know how they are. She made quotation marks in the air with her fingers, always, trying to get favors with touching stories. What Margaret didn't mention was that she had carefully edited the security footage, deliberately cutting out the part where Amara appeared in Kesha's arms. Nor did she mention that she had completely ignored the night watchman's report confirming the medical emergency. Meanwhile, Kesha discovered that finding work with a terminated for cause on her record was like trying to climb a mountain of ice. Every interview ended with the same question. Can you explain the circumstances of your last termination? On her fourth job attempt of the week, the cleaning manager at a shopping mall, Mrs. Carmen, was blunt. Look, honey, you seem like a nice person, but I can't risk hiring someone with a history of theft. I have my license to protect. Kesha returned home that afternoon carrying Amara and a growing sense of how the system was rigged against people like her. But instead of despair, something more dangerous began to form in her mind: cold, calculated determination. That night, while Amara finally fell asleep after hours of crying, babies feel their mother's stress. Kesha opened her laptop again. She wasn't looking for a job. She was studying. Specifically, she was rereading the emails Margaret didn't know. She had access to Dot as a member of the night cleaning crew. Kesha had an advantage that her arrogant supervisor never considered: physical access to offices after hours when executives left computers unlocked and confidential documents scattered about. For 2 years, while Margaret treated her like invisible furniture, Kesha had watched, listened, and when necessary, documented, not out of malice, but because of a lesson she learned at 16 when she was unfairly expelled from school for an incident she didn't commit. Always keep evidence, because no one will believe your word against theirs. What began as self-preservation had become an impressive archive. Emails from Margaret making racist comments about employees, fraudulent financial reports she had signed without reading, recorded conversations where she admitted to falsifying performance reviews to favor friends. Kesha smiled for the first time in days as she looked at the folder on her computer labeled insurance. Margaret had made the classic mistake of every bully, completely underestimating her victim. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Unknown number. Hello, Ms. Williams. This is Alexander Goldstein. Kesha almost dropped the phone. The Millionaire CEO was calling her at 9 o'clock at night. Mr. Goldstein. Her voice sounded more controlled than she felt. I apologize for the late hour, but I just heard about your dismissal. I would very much like to speak with you in person. Can you come to my office tomorrow? Kesha looked at Amara sleeping, then at the open laptop displaying months of evidence against Margaret Thompson. What time would be convenient, sir? How about 10 o'clock in the morning? And Ms. Williams? Yes. Bring your daughter. I have some very specific questions about last Thursday. After hanging up, Kesha leaned back in her chair. Margaret had spent the week celebrating her victory, spreading lies, and humiliating a single black mother without a job. What the supervisor had no idea was that she had messed with the wrong person. And tomorrow, when Kesha walked into that office, Margaret would be the one learning the true meaning of the phrase "mess with the wrong person." Because some people make the fatal mistake of confusing quietness with weakness, humility with ignorance, and patience with passivity. Margaret was about to learn the difference in the most painful way possible. The next morning, Kesha entered the Goldstein Industries skyscraper carrying a Mara and a briefcase Margaret would never have imagined existed. The same security guard who had escorted her 3 days earlier now greeted her respectfully. Direct orders from the CEO. In the executive elevator, Kesha watched her reflection in the polished mirror. 24 years old, a single mother, officially unemployed, but with something? Billionaire executives would pay fortunes to possess irrefutable evidence. Alexander Goldstein greeted her personally at the door to his office. At 42, the businessman had built an empire based on one simple rule: information is power. And something told him that the young woman standing before him possessed very valuable information. "Ms. Williams, thank you for coming. And this must be Amara." He smiled genuinely at the baby, who responded with a laugh. "Please have a seat. Can I offer you anything?" Kesha settled Amara into the baby carrier Alexander had provided. "Coffee would be great. Thank you." Margaret told me about your dismissal for trespassing. Alexander got straight to the point. "But last night I personally reviewed the security cameras. All of them." Kesha's eyes met his. "And what did you find?" "A desperate mother nursing her sick baby in a medical emergency, and a supervisor deliberately editing evidence to criminalize an act of motherhood." Alexander opened a folder on his computer. "This is the complete recording, unedited." On the screen, the image clearly showed Kesha comforting Amara, who was crying inconsolably before breastfeeding her. In the armchair dot, the timestamp confirmed at 2:15 a.m. during her official night cleaning shift. "Mr. Goldstein." Kesha took a deep breath. "There's something you need to know about Margaret Thompson. I'm listening." Kesha opened her folder, revealing hundreds of methodically organized documents. "For 2 years, while she treated me like invisible furniture, I watched, listened, and documented, not out of malice, but because I learned early on that people like me need evidence to be believed." Alexander flipped through the documents, his face growing increasingly serious. Emails from Margaret making racist comments about employees. Financial reports with forged signatures. Audio recordings where she admitted to manipulating performance reviews. "My God," Alexander murmured. "How long has this been going on?" 2 years documented. "Probably much longer." Kesha pointed to a specific recording. "This is from last Friday." Margaret, admitting that she edited the footage to frame me because, and I quote, "these people need to know their place." Alexander played the audio. Margaret's unmistakable voice echoed through the office. Black employee trying to seduce the boss with a single mother story. "Please, I edited the cameras to show only what matters, her trespassing. These people need to know their place." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander turned off the audio, his fists clenched on the table. "There's more," Kesha continued, keeping her voice calm. Financial fraud. She approved payments to shell companies owned by her boyfriend. Systematic discrimination against Black and Latino employees. 3 harassment lawsuits that were mysteriously filed away. Alexander picked up the intercom phone. "Marina, cancel all my appointments for today and connect me with Robert Chun, our lead counsel." As Alexander made the call, Kesha watched his reaction. It wasn't just professional outrage, it was personal fury. Margaret had used his company to perpetuate injustice while he unknowingly signed off on it. "Robert," Alexander said into the phone, "I need you to come to my office immediately. We have a situation that requires urgent legal action. Pause. Discrimination. Fraud, falsification of evidence. Bring your entire team." Hanging up. Alexander turned to Kesha. "Ms. Williams, I'd like to make you an offer. I'm listening. First, you will be reinstated immediately with back pay and compensation for damages. Second, I would like to offer you a position in the compliance department investigating internal irregularities." Kesha smiled for the first time in days. "And Margaret Thompson will be terminated for cause this afternoon. But before that, I want you to be present when we confront her with this evidence." At that moment, Amara woke up and smiled at Alexander as if approving the entire plan. Kesha picked her up, feeling for the first time in years that justice was possible. "Mr. Goldstein," she said, "there's something Margaret doesn't know about me." "What would that be?" "I graduated from law school through the local community night program. I studied while cleaning offices." Kesha smiled with a satisfaction Margaret could never imagine. When she finds out that the ignorant cleaning lady is actually a lawyer with a specialization in labor law, the look on her face will be priceless. Alexander laughed for the first time in weeks. "Ms. Williams, something tells me Margaret Thompson is about to learn a very valuable lesson about underestimating people." While Kesha organized her evidence into neat piles, Margaret was 3 floors below, bragging to her coworkers about how she had cleaned house by firing a problem employee. What the arrogant supervisor had no idea was that at that very moment, a team of specialized lawyers was being assembled, and that the ignorant cleaning lady she had humiliated had not only devastating evidence, but also the legal knowledge necessary to completely destroy her career. Because some people make the fatal mistake of confusing formal education with intelligence, social status with human value, and silence with ignorance. Margaret was about to discover that she had picked the wrong victim. A woman who turned every insult into motivation, every injustice into evidence, and every humiliation into fuel for revenge that was as legal as it was devastating. At 2:00 in the afternoon, Margaret Thompson received an urgent call to meet in the CEO's office. She climbed to the 40th floor, smiling, assuming Alexander would finally recognize her excellent work by firing a problem employee. The door opened, and Margaret stopped as if she had seen a ghost. Kesha Williams was sitting at the conference table wearing a professional blazer, with a stack of documents organized in front of her and a digital recorder in the center of the table. "What the hell is she doing here?" Margaret turned furiously to Alexander. "Sit down, Margaret," Alexander replied coldly. "We have a lot to talk about. I'm not sitting next to that lawyer." Kesha interrupted softly, her law school diploma now framed and visible on the desk. "Graduated with honors in labor law. You can call me Dr. Williams." Margaret's face turned pale. "This is ridiculous. She works as a cleaner." She did, Alexander corrected, while attending law school at night. "Something you would have discovered if you had checked our employees' complete resumes instead of judging them by the color of their skin." Robert Chun, the company's lead attorney, entered the room carrying a bulging briefcase. "Miss Thompson, I am obliged to inform you that you are being terminated for cause effective immediately. You will also face criminal charges for evidence tampering, fraud, and racial discrimination." Margaret laughed nervously. "Are you out of your minds? Based on what?" Kesha turned on the recorder, and Margaret's unmistakable voice echoed through the room. "Black employee trying to seduce the boss with a single mother story. Please, I edited the cameras to show only what matters, her trespassing. These people need to know their place." Where did you get this?" Margaret stammered, her face draining of color. 2 Fridays ago at happy hour at Chester's bar, Kesha replied calmly. You were so busy bragging you didn't notice my phone recording. You at the next table. Alexander opened his laptop, displaying dozens of emails. These are just the last 6 months, Margaret. Comments about diversity quotas, jokes about the limited intellectual capacity of black employees, discussions about screening out undesirable candidates. Margaret tried to get up, but Robert Chun blocked the door. We're not done yet, Miss Thompson. Kesha slid a folder across the table. Page 17. You approved $340,000 in payments to your boyfriend Derek Martinez's construction company. Companies that don't exist in official records. That's you can't. Page 23. Kesha continued relentlessly. 3 Latino employees fired for poor performance the same week they reported his discriminatory practices to HR. Curious coincidence. Alexander stood up, his voice cutting like ice. Page 31. Sarah Mitchell, employee who reported sexual harassment by a supervisor. You closed the case in 48 hours without investigation, and she was transferred to the night shift. Margaret slumped heavily in her chair, her arrogance evaporating. You don't understand. I was protecting the company. Protecting? Kesha laughed for the first time, a humorless sound. You were committing federal crimes documented for 2 years. Crimes I witnessed firsthand while you treated me like furniture. Robert Chin opened his briefcase. Ms. Thompson, the FBI is investigating financial fraud. Department of Justice has initiated proceedings for civil rights violations, and the company is suing you for $5 million in punitive damages. $5 million? Margaret clung to the table, trying to steady herself. That's just what we spent on out-of-court settlements for cases you barely resolved in the last 3 years. Alexander explained, not to mention the current litigation costs. Kesha stood up and walked to the window. You know what's funny, Margaret? For 2 years, you saw me as such a minor threat that you didn't even bother to check my background. If you had, you would have found out that I specialize in workplace discrimination. Cases. You planned this, Margaret whispered, finally grasping the magnitude of her situation. I protected myself, Kesha corrected. I learned early on that people like you exist, so I always kept evidence. I never imagined you'd be stupid enough to hand over so much proof. Alexander pressed the intercom. Security, please escort the former Mrs. Thompson to the exit. Her belongings will be sent to her by mail. Margaret stood up unsteadily, her mask of superiority completely shattered. You can't do this to me. I have rights. You did, Robert Chun replied dryly. You lost them all when you decided to falsify evidence and commit fraud. Incidentally, the press will be waiting for you at the main exit. Channel 7 received a copy of the recordings. Margaret's face contorted in panic. The press? No, you can't. Racial discrimination is public news, Margaret Kesha observed calmly, especially when it involves executives of large corporations. Your name will be in the papers tomorrow. When security arrived, Margaret turned one last time. Her pride destroyed, but her bitterness intact. You may have won this time, but people like you always go back to where you came from. Kesha smiled with a serenity that made Margaret realized too late that she had deeply underestimated the woman she had tried to destroy. Margaret, people like me don't go back to where they came from. We build better places. As Margaret was escorted through the corridors where she had once reigned with arrogance, employees left their offices to watch her fall. Some whispered, others just watched silently as the woman who had terrorized so many colleagues for years walked through the corridors of Goldstein Industries for the last time. Alexander turned to Kesha, who was calmly organizing her documents. Dr. Williams, there's one last thing. Yes, Mr. Goldstein. Would you like to be our new Director of Human Resources? Margaret's position is vacant, and frankly, you've proven yourself to be more qualified than anyone I've ever met. Outside, Margaret faced a pack of reporters with cameras and microphones, their questions echoing through the lobby as she tried to cover her face and escape the public humiliation she had created for herself. Upstairs on the 40th floor, Kesha Williams held her daughter Amara in her arms as she signed the contract that would make her one of the youngest executives in the company. Because sometimes when you plant injustice, what grows back isn't justice. It's an unstoppable force that turns victims into victors and transforms the very definition of what true power means. Margaret had learned the hard way that some people make the fatal mistake of confusing silence with weakness, humility with ignorance, and skin color with intellectual capacity. But the price for that lesson would be paid for a long time in courtrooms, headlines, and the complete destruction of a career built on contempt for others. 6 months later, Kesha Williams sat in her office on the 40th floor, reviewing the new diversity policies she had implemented at Goldstein Industries. Her mahogany desk was decorated with photos of Amara, now 10 months old, taking her first steps in a company nursery, the same nursery she had proposed and which now served 53 employees' children. Outside, through the panoramic windows, she could see the city stretching out endlessly. There was something deeply symbolic about that view. The same woman Margaret had considered only fit for cleaning now made decisions that affected thousands of lives. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Dr. Williams, her assistant, announced, "The legal team is on the line. Margaret Thompson's criminal trial has been set for next Tuesday." Kesha smiled briefly. Margaret had tried to appeal her dismissal, then attempted an out-of-court settlement, then finally hired expensive lawyers to fight the criminal charges. Nothing had worked. The evidence was irrefutable, the damages documented, the discrimination proven beyond a reasonable doubt. "Thanks, Patricia. Any news on the lawsuits filed by the employees she wronged?" "Yes, ma'am. All 14 cases have been settled favorably. The company will pay compensation totaling $2.3 million to Margaret's victims of discrimination." 2 hours later, Alexander appeared at her door carrying coffee and bagels. This had become a tradition in formal meetings where they discussed not only business but also how their lives had changed since that first traumatic encounter. "How's our little CEO in training?" Alexander asked, pointing to Amara, who was playing in her portable playpen in the corner of the office. "Learning early that you should never underestimate anyone," Kesha replied, picking up her daughter, "especially women who look like us." Alexander sat down, watching mother and daughter with a genuine affection he had developed for both of them. "I got an interesting call today. Harvard Business School wants you to be the keynote speaker at their conference on corporate leadership and social justice." Harvard. Kesha nearly spilled her coffee. "They know that 6 months ago I was cleaning toilets to make ends meet. They know exactly who you are, and they want 600 future executives to hear how you turn discrimination into a corporate revolution." Alexander smiled. "The title of the speech will be 'When the System Underestimates You, How to Turn the Tables.'" At that moment, Patricia entered with a serious expression. "Dr. Williams, there's a lady at the front desk asking to speak with you. She says her name is Margaret Thompson." The silence that followed was tense. Alexander rose instinctively, but Kesha remained calm, stroking Amara's hair. "Send her up, Kesha," Alexander began. "You don't have to. I do. Some conversations are necessary." 5 minutes later, Margaret entered the office that had once been his domain. She looked like she had aged a decade in 6 months. Cheap clothes replaced expensive suits. Unkempt hair where once there had been impeccable styles, eyes that had lost all arrogance, replaced by a mixture of despair and humiliation. "Kesha," Margaret began, her voice almost a whisper, I know I have no right to be here, but you're right. Kesha interrupted gently, not getting up from her chair. You don't have the right, but you're here anyway. What do you want? Margaret looked around the office, the plaques on the wall, the photos of Kesha receiving diversity awards, the panoramic view that was once hers. I wanted to apologize. Why? Kesha asked, genuinely curious. Because you got caught? Because you lost everything? Or because you finally understand that destroying people out of prejudice has consequences? Margaret lowered her eyes, unable to hold Kesha's calm, penetrating gaze. Because I was wrong about everything. About you about. Who deserves opportunities. About Margaret. Kesha finally stood up. Amara still in her arms. Your apologies won't give back the dignity you took from 14 employees. They won't erase the racist comments you made for years. And they certainly won't change the fact that you falsified evidence to destroy me. I know. I just wanted you to know. But I understand now how wrong I was. Kesha walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Do you know what my biggest mistake was, Margaret? What was it? Thinking that people like you could change if you were treated with dignity and respect. Kesha turned away, her expression serene but firm. You're only here because you lost everything. If you still had power, you'd still be the same person who tried to destroy me. Margaret tried to respond, but couldn't find the words. The truth of Kesha's words cut deeper than any accusation. You can go now, Kesha said finally. And Margaret, good luck finding a job. I hope you now understand what it's like to be judged. Before you even open your mouth. After Margaret left, Alexander watched Kesha with renewed admiration. You were kinder to her than she deserved. It wasn't kindness, Kesha smiled, kissing Amara's forehead. It was justice. The best revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's building something greater than they could ever imagine. 6 months after that traumatic first day, Kesha Williams was no longer just a survivor. She was a revolutionary who had turned her pain into purpose, her humiliation into power, and her forced silence into a voice that echoed through corporate hallways across the country. Margaret had tried to break a 24-year-old black woman who cleaned toilets to support her daughter. Instead, she had created an executive who would forever change the face of corporate justice in America. Because sometimes, when you try to bury someone, you make the fatal mistake of not realizing that you are planting a seed. And some seeds grow into trees so big that they cast shadows over those who tried to destroy them. Margaret Thompson learned the hard way that you should never underestimate the strength of a mother fighting for her daughter's future. Especially when that mother has not only unconditional love, but also intelligence, education, and the patience to wait for the perfect moment to prove that some people make the mistake of confusing silence with weakness. If this story of transformation and justice has inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true victory does not come from revenge, but from the ability to transform injustice into an opportunity to grow beyond what our oppressors could ever imagine.